Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a book that's generating a lot of buzz, quietly, though. Quietly. Have you heard of The Theocrat?
I have.
It's a bit of an underground sensation, and today we're going to unpack why that is.
Well, one of the things that makes it so interesting to me, at least, is that the book is self-published. That already kind of tells you something about the author's journey, doesn't it?
Right.
It's like they're deliberately bypassing traditional gatekeepers to get their message out.
Yeah, and what a message it is. The author sets out to draw some pretty startling parallels between, of all things, the Bible and Mein Kampf.
Yeah, I know that might sound shocking to some listeners, but the book, just to be clear, the book isn't advocating for either
Oh,
ideology.
yeah.
Instead, it attempts to analyze how the author sees these two texts as intertwined. It's a deep dive into a perspective that's definitely outside the mainstream.
And that's what we're here for, to explore those less traveled paths of thought. So tell me, what's the core argument here? How does the author connect the Bible to Hitler's manifesto?
Well, the author's central premise is that the Bible, in their interpretation at least, provides a blueprint for a society based on racial purity. And they believe Hitler, in writing Mein Kampf, was attempting to create a society based on this very blueprint.
Okay, so we're talking about some pretty controversial territory here. What's the author's background? What leads them to this interpretation?
Well, the author is a self-described baby boomer, and they believe their generation was essentially misled about the true nature of reality. They place a huge emphasis on the concept of race, even calling it the biggest truth and reality in existence.
It's definitely a worldview that's gained traction in certain circles. So how does the Bible fit into all of this?
The author points to the book of Daniel, specifically the passage that says, seal the book. They interpret this as meaning that the Bible's true message was meant to be hidden until modern times. And that hidden message, according to them, is all about racial purity.
So they believe there's a secret message embedded within the Bible. That's a pretty bold claim. What kind of evidence do they present to support this?
The author sees history as a cyclical story of civilizations rising and falling. Each rise is characterized by racial purity, and each fall is marked by what they call racial mixing. They believe we're currently in the midst of another decline, and that's where their interpretation of the Bible comes in.
It sounds like they're drawing a very direct line between the past and the present. Do they offer any specifics about how this cyclical pattern has played out throughout history?
Yeah, they focus heavily on the role of Jewish people in history. They argue that they have deliberately accelerated the decline of white civilizations. It's a very controversial and sensitive topic, but it's central to understanding their argument.
This definitely takes us into some murky waters, and it sounds like they're drawing upon some pretty age-old and dangerous stereotypes. But for the sake of understanding their argument, how do they connect this to their interpretation of the Bible and its hidden message?
They believe this so-called final safe spot for white people is disappearing due to the influence they attribute to Jewish people. They use a rather stark analogy, comparing it to being in a car that's been carjacked. The implication being that Western civilization willingly got into the car with the carjacker a century ago, and we're now on a path to destruction.
Okay, so we've got a self-published author, a secret message in the Bible, and a carjacking analogy to describe the state of the world. Where does Mein Kampf fit into all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. The author sees Mein Kampf as a mirror reflecting the Bible's hidden message. They argue that both texts, in their view, advocate for racial purity and a divinely ordained hierarchy.
So they're essentially saying that Hitler was, in their mind, trying to implement what they see as the Bible's true teachings. That's a pretty provocative claim, to say the least.
And just like they believe the Bible was sealed until modern times, they argue that most people don't grasp the true meaning of Mein Kampf either. They go so far as to say that both the media and the entertainment industries are controlled by Jewish people, echoing what they interpret as Hitler's own views.
So we've got a double layer of hidden messages and a grand conspiracy theory thrown in for good measure. How does the author support such a bold and, frankly, unsettling claim?
They point out that both texts, despite their vastly different contexts, condemn what they see as the major ills plaguing society today. And they do this in part by meticulously analyzing specific passages from the Bible.
This is where we need to tread carefully. We're about to delve into an interpretation of the Bible that is not only unorthodox, but potentially dangerous. It's important to remember that we're not endorsing these views, but simply trying to understand how the author constructs their argument.
Absolutely. It's about unpacking a line of thinking, not validating it. The
Hmm.
author looks at passages like Genesis 49:9, where Judah is described as a lion's whelp.
And Matthew 10.5 to 6, where Jesus instructs his disciples to focus on the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Right.
And also Matthew 15.24-26, which tells the story of the Canaanite woman asking for healing for her daughter.
Right.
These, along with passages that condemn interracial marriage and cultural exchange, are, in the author's view, evidence of the Bible's racially exclusive message.
And here's where the author's attempt at connecting the dots becomes very clear. They try to show how these passages align with what they believe are Hitler's own views on race and society.
So they're weaving together biblical interpretation and Nazi ideology to create a single narrative. It's a fascinating, if unsettling, approach.
And to further bolster their argument, they delve into Hitler's personal history, specifically his time in Vienna, as described in Mein Kampf.
I'm curious to hear how they frame this period in Hitler's life. Do they see it as a turning point?
Absolutely. They believe that Hitler's time in Vienna was when his ideology truly took shape. They claim it was during this period that Hitler became acutely aware of what he called the menaces of Marxism and Jewry.
And of course, the author sees this as a direct link to their own belief that modern society is being manipulated by a specific group of people. It's a pretty classic example of how personal experiences can be distorted and used to justify prejudice.
Exactly. They quote Hitler extensively, particularly his descriptions of Vienna as a city overrun by what he termed racial desecration. They use these anecdotes from Mein Kampf to add a layer of personal experience to their broader arguments.
It's a clever, albeit manipulative tactic. By humanizing Hitler in this way, they're trying to make his ideology seem less monstrous and more understandable, even relatable.
And that's where the real danger lies, because once you start down that path of rationalizing hatred, it becomes very easy to lose sight of the truly horrific consequences.
Well, we're certainly venturing into some dark territory here. But it's important to shed light on these kinds of ideologies, no matter how disturbing they might be. So let's continue to unpack the author's argument. What else do they pull from Mein Kampf to support their claims?
They move on to examine how specific elements of Hitler's ideology, as laid out in Mein Kampf, mirror what they interpret as the Bible's teachings. For example, they point to Hitler's view of Marxism as a Jewish plot designed to undermine the natural order of society.
And of course, they highlight Hitler's views on the alleged Jewish influence on media and culture, which aligns perfectly with their own anxieties about modern society.
Right. And then there's the cornerstone of Nazi ideology, the belief in the necessity of racial purity for the survival of the Aryan race.
And according to the author, all of these views can be traced back to the Bible, particularly those passages that warn against intermingling with other cultures and races.
That's the crux of their argument, that Hitler's worldview was, in their eyes, rooted in biblical principles. They're trying to establish a direct line of descent from ancient scripture to 20th century fascism.
It's a bold claim, to say the least, and it raises a lot of questions about the nature of interpretation, the dangers of confirmation bias, and the very real consequences of twisting sacred texts to fit a particular agenda.
Absolutely. We're witnessing a masterclass in cherry-picking evidence and manipulating language to suit a predetermined narrative.
And that's why it's so crucial to engage with these kinds of arguments critically. We can't just dismiss them as the ravings of a fringe lunatic. We need to understand how these ideas take root, how they spread, and how they can ultimately lead to real-world harm.
I completely agree. Understanding the mechanics of extremism is the first step toward combating it.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, but we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this deeply troubling book. I'm both fascinated and horrified to see where this deep dive takes us next.
It's definitely a journey into the heart of darkness. But sometimes the most illuminating truths are found in the darkest places.
So let's press on, shall we? I have a feeling things are about to get even more intense.
So, picking up where we left off last time, the author goes on to tackle arguably the most sensitive and controversial aspect of Hitler's ideology, the final solution.
That's the chilling euphemism the Nazis used for the systematic extermination of Jews during World War II. How on earth does the author try to reconcile this with their interpretation of the Bible?
This is where the author's perspective takes a particularly disturbing turn. They attempt to frame the final solution as a tragic but necessary step to preserve the Aryan race, even going so far as to draw parallels to Old Testament commands to eliminate certain groups.
Wait, so they're actually trying to justify genocide by citing the Bible? That's incredibly dangerous and morally reprehensible.
It is. And it's a stark reminder of how easily religious texts can be twisted to serve hateful agendas. The author views the destruction of Nazi Germany as a setback for the cause of racial purity, lamenting what they perceive as the loss of a crucial opportunity to establish a world order based on their twisted interpretation of Scripture.
This is where I really struggle to understand the author's mindset. How can they possibly view the downfall of a regime responsible for such horrific atrocities as a setback?
Their concluding message is a call for a reawakening of racial consciousness, urging readers to embrace what they believe are the Bible's true teachings and to work towards the creation of a society based on racial separation.
It's a chilling reminder that these kinds of dangerous ideologies are still alive and well, even in the 21st century. And it underscores the importance of education, critical thinking, and open dialogue as antidotes to hate and prejudice.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has taken us to some very dark corners of human thought. But it's crucial that we shine a light on these dangerous ideas no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
This raises so many questions for me. For example, the author relies heavily on Hitler's own words from Mein Kampf to build their case. But how reliable is Hitler as a source? I mean, the man was a master propagandist, a pathological liar who twisted the truth to suit his own twisted purposes.
That's a crucial point. We can't simply take Hitler's words at face value. We need to consider the context, his motivations, and the fact that he was writing for a specific audience, aiming to sway public opinion and gain power. The author seems to accept Hitler's self-serving pronouncements uncritically, further weakening their already dubious arguments.
Speaking of Mein Kampf, the author seems particularly fixated on Hitler's time in Vienna. They portray it as a kind of crucible that forged his hateful ideology. What specifically about that period in Hitler's life did they focus on?
They zero in on the fact that Hitler, by his own account, experienced intense poverty and hardship in Vienna. They claim this exposure to the underbelly of society, coupled with his observations of the city's diverse population, fueled his resentment towards immigrants and those he deemed racially different.
It sounds like the author is trying to paint a picture of Hitler as a victim, someone who was driven to extremism by the circumstances of his life. But isn't that a dangerous oversimplification?
Absolutely. It's an attempt to humanize Hitler, to make him seem more relatable and perhaps even sympathetic. But we can't lose sight of the fact that he was a deeply disturbed individual who made choices that led to the deaths of millions.
The author also emphasizes Hitler's own words about encountering the so-called menaces of Marxism and Jewry in Vienna. It's almost as if they're trying to validate Hitler's prejudices by suggesting they were based on real-world observation.
That's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to create a narrative where Hitler's hateful ideology was a rational response to the world around him, rather than the product of a warped and hateful mind. They quote Hitler extensively, particularly his descriptions of Vienna as a city rife with what he called racial desecration. But they fail to critically examine those claims or consider alternative perspectives.
It's a classic example of confirmation bias. They're seeking out evidence that supports their preconceived notions while ignoring anything that contradicts their worldview. And in doing so, they're inadvertently spreading Hitler's propaganda.
That's a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
The importance of critical thinking and questioning sources. We can't just passively absorb information, especially when it comes to such sensitive and potentially dangerous topics. We need to be active readers, listeners, and thinkers.
The author clearly feels a sense of urgency, even desperation, about what they perceive as the precarious state of the white race. They believe that the forces of globalism, multiculturalism, and the called Jewish influence are actively conspiring to destroy white civilization.
It's a classic us versus them narrative that's been used throughout history to justify discrimination, oppression, and violence.
They see Hitler's rise to power as a desperate attempt to stave off this destruction, an attempt that ultimately failed. And they seem to be warning that unless there's a reawakening of racial consciousness among white people, then their fate is sealed.
It's a dangerous and harmful message, one that preys on people's fears and anxieties. And it's a reminder that these kinds of ideologies can have very real consequences. Well, this has been quite the deep dive so far. It's like we've taken a plunge into the depths of a very dark and troubled mind. It's definitely been a challenging and unsettling journey. But it's important to remember that even the most disturbing ideas can teach us something.
Absolutely. By understanding the author's perspective, however flawed or repugnant it may be, we can gain a deeper understanding of how prejudice and extremism take root.
We can also learn to recognize the tactics that are used to manipulate and control people, both in the past and in the present.
And ultimately, that knowledge can help us to resist those forces and build a more just and equitable world.
Couldn't agree more. Now, the author goes on to examine how Hitler, in Mein Kampf, articulated his vision for leadership, They highlight the qualities that Hitler believed made a great leader, drawing comparisons between his ideas and what they see as the Bible's portrayal of strong, decisive figures.
Interesting. So they're trying to draw a connection between Hitler's leadership style and the leadership qualities of biblical figures. What specific qualities do they focus on?
They highlight Hitler's emphasis on charisma, willpower, and the ability to inspire and motivate the masses. They also point out Hitler's conviction that a leader must be willing to make tough choices, even unpopular ones, for the good of the nation.
They're essentially painting a picture of Hitler as a strong, decisive leader who was willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. But isn't that a dangerous oversimplification?
It is. They're glossing over the fact that Hitler was a ruthless dictator who was responsible for the deaths of millions. They compare him to biblical figures like Moses, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, and David, who united the tribes of Israel and established a powerful kingdom.
It seems like they're trying to legitimize Hitler's leadership by associating him with these revered figures from religious history.
Exactly. They're trying to create a narrative where Hitler is not the villain of history, but a misunderstood visionary who was guided by higher principles. They argue that Hitler was a man of destiny, chosen by God to lead the Aryan race to victory, but that he was ultimately betrayed and defeated by the forces of darkness.
It's a very romanticized view of Hitler, one that completely ignores the horrors of the Nazi regime.
It is. And it's a dangerous narrative because it can lead people to believe that Hitler was actually a good leader, someone to be admired and emulated.
It's a chilling thought, but it's a reminder that even the most monstrous ideologies can find adherents. People who are willing to overlook the evil in order to embrace the message.
This is why it's so important to understand the roots of extremism, to see how seemingly benign ideas can be twisted and manipulated to justify hatred and violence.
We need to be vigilant to challenge prejudice and intolerance wherever we encounter it.
Because if we're not careful, history has a way of repeating itself.
You know, as we've been dissecting this book, there's one term that keeps popping up that I can't ignore. This idea of the Aryan. It's a word loaded with historical baggage, and frankly, it makes me uncomfortable.
You're right to feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
The term Aryan is inextricably linked to Nazi ideology and the horrors of the Holocaust. It's a word that should be used with extreme caution, if at all.
Yeah, and the author doesn't seem to have any such reservations. They use the term repeatedly throughout the book, seemingly interchangeably with white. But it feels like they're trying to imbue it with something more, some kind of like mystical significance.
You've hit on a crucial point. The author isn't just using Aryan as a synonym for white. They're tapping into a whole web of pseudoscientific beliefs about racial superiority that were central to Nazi ideology.
So they're drawing on those distorted ideas about a master race, a concept that was used to justify some of the most horrific crimes in human history.
Exactly. They repeatedly quote Hitler's pronouncements about the supposed physical and intellectual superiority of the Aryan race, warning of the dangers of racial mixing, and predicting the downfall of the white race if it continues to intermingle with other races.
It's a chilling echo of the rhetoric that led to the Holocaust, a reminder that these dangerous ideas are still circulating even in our supposedly enlightened times.
The author's obsession with the term Aryan speaks to the enduring power of myths and symbols. They're using this loaded term to evoke a sense of pride, belonging, and purpose among white people who feel alienated and dispossessed in a world that's rapidly changing around them.
It's like they're offering a simple, seductive explanation for the complexities of the world, a way to make sense of their anxieties and frustrations by blaming everything on an outside enemy, the other.
Precisely. And that kind of thinking is incredibly dangerous. It creates a false sense of unity based on exclusion and hatred, and it can easily lead to violence and oppression.
It's a reminder that we need to be constantly vigilant, to challenge these kinds of divisive ideologies wherever we encounter them, and to promote understanding and respect between people of all backgrounds.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been a journey into a dark and twisted worldview, a stark reminder of the dangers of uncritical thinking and the enduring allure of hateful ideologies.
Yeah, it's been unsettling to say the least, but also incredibly illuminating.
By understanding how these kinds of arguments are constructed, we can better equip ourselves to dismantle them. We can learn to spot the logical fallacies, the manipulative language, and the distorted interpretations of history that underpin these hateful beliefs.
And hopefully by exposing these ideas to the light of reason and critical analysis, we can help prevent them from taking root and spreading.
You know, this deep dive has been a stark reminder that ideas have consequences, words have power, And the choices we make, both individually and collectively, determine the kind of world we create.
It's a call to action, an invitation to engage in the ongoing struggle against ignorance, hatred, and intolerance.
We hope this exploration of the Theocrat has provided you with some valuable insights into the nature of extremism, the dangers of propaganda, and the importance of critical thinking. As always, we encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different perspectives, and to do your part in building a more just and compassionate world. The author's attempt to connect Hitler's ideology with the Bible should serve as a stark warning. Even the most seemingly benign ideas can be twisted and manipulated to serve dark purposes. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be critical consumers of information, to question authority, and to challenge hateful ideologies wherever we encounter them. And perhaps most importantly, it compels us to ask ourselves a crucial question. What are the seemingly harmless ideas in our own time that could be similarly distorted and weaponized in the future?